endlessly searching for an original sin.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Sweet Pool. My voice is doing a lot better as you can hear, so it's time to continue. I keep forgetting the new Japanese style. After changing his shoes, Yuji was about to walk outside when he realized it was raining. The sky had been so clear at lunchtime, but now it was covered in thick clouds. The humid air clung to his skin. He hadn't been expecting it to rain today, so hadn't brought an umbrella. Yuji despised the rain. The sound, the smell, the sight. It all brought that horrible memory rushing back to his mind. His body trembled as he remembered the chill, the cold trickle running down his spine. He contemplated waiting for the weather to clear up, but he had no way of knowing how long it would last. His only option was to suck it up and make a run for the station. He stared up at the gray sky, working up his courage, and something appeared in the corner of his eye. He turned to look and promptly did a double take. Tetsuo was standing there holding a clear plastic umbrella. Immediately, Yuji turned away and walked out into the rain. His body was moving on autopilot. He didn't stop to think. He just needed to get away from Tetsuo. And yet, the umbrella still hovered on the edge of his vision. Tetsuo was following him. Yuji sped up, but to no avail. The umbrella kept pace effortlessly. Wait. Was Tetsuo trying to share the umbrella with him? This belated realization triggered a rush of embarrassment. He'd been too focused on getting away to consider the possibility. Feeling like a jerk, he slowed his pace until he and Tetsuo were walking side by side. Together they passed through the school gates and headed down the road to the train station, the rain beating against the umbrella in a dull drone. What was he doing, walking down the street with Tetsuo of all people? This wasn't like him.
準備いいな。
Yuji kept his eyes forward. He knew he ought to thank Tetsuo, but couldn't bring himself to say the words.
母さんが。そうか。
Silence fell, and Yuji turned his gaze towards the rows of identical houses. He could detect the pleasant smell amid the scent of the rain. The same smell that always wafted in Tetsuo's vicinity. He took a deep breath and felt himself relax slightly. Most of the time, he resented the rain for reminding him of what happened by the dumpsters. But right now, strangely enough, he didn't really mind it. It felt a lot softer today than it had back then. Arriving at the station, the two of them boarded the train without exchanging words. The cars were more packed than usual, and Yuji was forced to stand facing Tetsuo for the duration of the ride. Heading home as usual, taking the trains as usual. Everything was just the same as any other day, except this time Tetsuo was there. It all felt so surreal. The train arrived at Yuji's station. He expected to say goodbye here, but Tetsuo followed him onto the platform.
次だろ。お前が降りる駅。ああ。なんでここで降りたんだよ。傘、持ってないだろ。
Aw. That was his reason? Maybe that was the polite thing to do for a girl, but Yuji was a guy. He could handle a little rain. But though surprised and annoyed, Yuji didn't protest. It was too late anyway. He walked through the turnstile with Tetsuo close behind. Outside the station, crowds of people milled past on their way home. Everyone had an umbrella. The sky had darkened a few shades since they left school. Tetsuo opened his umbrella and stepped out into the rain. Yuji moved to follow, but stopped himself. Was he supposed to walk shoulder to shoulder with Tetsuo like it was normal? Something about that felt wrong. Tetsuo stopped and looked back at him. There was something animal in those sharp eyes. They made him feel restless, awkward. He couldn't just leave Tetsuo hanging. Reluctantly, he stepped under the umbrella, and Tetsuo began to walk forward once more. Why was he going along with this? He was letting Tetsuo have his way. And yet, Yuji found that he didn't really mind. As they progressed along the road to Yuji's house, the surroundings grew more residential, and pedestrian became scarce. Cars passed them on the street, splashing through the puddles, sheets of rain glittering in their headlights.
神谷が、え？
Without turning his head, Tetsuo began to speak.
神谷が勉強見てやれって。ああ。やばいの。
He didn't answer, but he knew his silence was as good as yes. Feeling pathetic, he hung his head, which was when the ringing started. Tetsuo dug his phone out of his book bag.
はい。はい。
Sir. Evidently, it was someone important. Yuji watched Tetsuo from the corner of his eye. He was a little surprised that anyone would call him. He knew it was unfair to think that, but still.
わかりました。はい。それじゃあ、その日に。
Tetsuo hung up.
先生からか。いや。
He stuffed his phone back into his bag and faced forward once more.
バイト。バイト？ヘルプ頼まれて。
Yuji recalled something Makoto had told him. Supposedly, Tetsuo worked for a seedy part of town.
バイトって何の？バーテン。今はヘルプ頼まれた時だけだけど。
Bartending, huh? Yuji didn't know if that qualified as shady, but the school definitely wouldn't have approved.
年とかまずくないのか？ああ、まあ。なんでバーテンなんだよ。なんとなく。つか、店長から声かけられて。
He didn't sound too enthusiastic about working there. In fact, Yuji got the impression he didn't care either way.
勉強どうする？ああ。
Yuji glanced at Tetsuo. Their eyes met.
昼休みとかは？じゃあそれで。
Yuji answered automatically, looking away. Tetsuo's gaze always made him feel uncomfortable. He had to brace himself for it in advance, or else the eye contact would make him want to bolt. Ahead, Yuji's white apartment complex was finally in sight. They walked together all the way to the main entrance, where Yuji stopped.
ここでいい。
He turned to look at Tetsuo and noticed something. Tetsuo's right shoulder was soaked. He sacrificed his own space under the umbrella for Yuji.
それ、右肩。悪い。
He stammered out a brief apology, and Tetsuo glanced down at himself.
それ、タオル貸すから、拭いてけよ。いや、いい。
Tetsuo replied shortly, then turned to walk away. Okay. Stop doing that. You know what? Let's start number 2. Oh, wrong one. Before he knew it, Yuji had reached out and grabbed Tetsuo's arm. He felt a moment of panic. What was he doing? Tetsuo turned and fixed Yuji with his stoic gaze.
何？
Yuji had no words. Even he wasn't sure why he'd stopped him. A few drops of rain hit his arm. What had gotten into him? Cursing his stupidity, he started to let go. But Tetsuo grabbed him back.
No!
He pulled Yuji forward, out into the rain. His breath touched Yuji's ear.
この間は乱暴にして悪かった。
Then he relinquished his grip, turned away, and walked off. Yuji stared after him in a blank disbelief. Was he referring to that rainy Friday? Sorry for being rough. That could only mean one thing. Even after Tetsuo had vanished from sight, Yuji kept staring out into the rain. After finally entering his apartment, Yuji was changing out of his uniform when the doorbell rang. Was it Tetsuo? Had he forgotten something? Yuji's chest had felt heavy ever since they'd parted ways. The pressure turned to panic as he rushed to the door. Heart racing, Yuji worked the deadbolt and twisted the doorknob. He opened the door and blinked. Makoto was standing there, drenched from head to toe. He didn't seem to have an umbrella with him. Yuji glanced up at the sky behind him. It was raining even harder now. The rain blew in, soaking Makoto's back.
どうしたんだよ。傘は。
But Makoto simply shook his head and stared at the floor between them. He must have been freezing, judging from the way his jaw was clenched. Yuji wasn't sure what had happened, but he knew he needed to get Makoto inside before he caught a cold.
上がれよ。それじゃ風邪ひくだろ。シャワー使ってくか？いい。
Makoto shook his head listlessly.
何かあったのか？だよ。え？
He thought he heard Makoto mumble something, but didn't quite catch what he said. Slowly, Makoto balled his hands into a fist.
だよ。なんで？だよ。誠？なんでなんだよ！
The blow to his eardrums made Yuji wince. Makoto's fists were shaking.
落ち着けよ。何が？なんでダメなんだよ！
Just have a harem already. He looked up and seized Yuji by the shoulders, digging his fingers in so hard it hurt. なあ、どうして？ Without knowing what had provoked Makoto's aggression, Yuji had no idea how to respond. Just then, his phone vibrated loudly in his pocket. Face twisted with rage, Makoto thrust his hand into Yuji's pocket.
あいつなんだろう。誠、やめろ。
Makoto pulled Yuji's phone out of his pants.
くそ！
Then, with a look of utter anguish, he flung it down the hallway behind Yuji. And that, sir, is how you get kicked right back out into the rain and off the balcony. So, do cooler heads prevail in this? Or do we go all out? I am curious. You threw my phone, I have a right to be mad. Oh, wrong one. Yuji didn't know what to do. He stared at Makoto in shock and silence. Makoto returned to his stare with pleading eyes. A moment passed, then a whimper escaped Makoto's lips, and he turned away. Releasing his grip on Yuji's shoulder, he clutched his hair.
で、どうして俺じゃダメなんだろ。なんで？
Good enough for what? But before Yuji could ask, Makoto stepped back, eyes fixed on the floor.
ごめん。帰る。誠！
He turned and walked down the hallway. Yuji started to follow, but something stopped him. Makoto's back shirt. Makoto's back, shirt soaked through the rain, the way his shoulders shivered from the cold. It felt like he was pushing the world away. Despite his worry, Yuji could only watch him go. After Makoto left, Yuji went back inside and closed the door behind him. Retrieving his phone from the floor, he checked his notifications. There was a missed call from Erika. As relieved as he was to see her name, he wasn't ready to call her back just yet. Clearly, something was going on with Makoto. He seemed to be growing more unstable. Yuji thought back to what he said on the doorway. What did all that mean? Why did he seem so desperate? After a few minutes considering this, Yuji realized that he didn't really know Makoto all that well. He had no way of guessing what might be in his head. Still, Yuji had a feeling that Makoto needed help. Plagued with the lingering unease, Yuji took his phone back to his room. The clack of wood echoed in the empty dining room as a pair of dice rolled across the floor. Thin, pale fingers reached out, scooped them up, and tossed them again. It was late at night. Zenya was crouched in the middle of the room, rolling his dice again and again. Scoop, toss, over and over and over. His one good eye stared at them intently. The same. Every time the exact same result.
Botchan?
Kitani entered, squinting to pick out Zenya in the darkness.
Botchan, こんな時間に何を?
Can't you see? Zenya kept rolling the dice. The last thing he needed was an interruption. Wait. Kitani might know something.
Kitani?
はい。
これさ、このダイス、なんかさ、おかしいみたい。
何がですか？
ダイス占い。幼児と哲夫のことを占ってたんだけどさ、見ればわかるだろ？明らかに、おかしいじゃねえかよ。
There was hesitation in Kitani's tone.
特におかしなところはないように思いますが。
Zenya froze.
ないわけ。ないだろうが。
ですが。
ちゃんと目ん玉ついてんのか？よく見ろよ。どう見たっておかしいだろうが。
That's a nice pose. Zenya snatched up the dice and flung them down hard onto the floor. The dice bounced a small distance away. Zenya leaned forward on his hands and knees and scooped them up, then rolled them again. The results wouldn't change. They had to be broken. The more he tried, the worse he felt.
変わらねえんだよ。幼児と哲夫のことになると、何度やっても同じ目しか出ないんだよ。どういうことなんだよ、これは。
The gods just do not want you with him. Uncertainty crept into Kitani's expression.
坊ちゃん、本当に何度やっても同じ目だと。
どう見たってそうだろうが。
私には。
Kitani paused and exhaled loudly.
私にはバラバラの目が出ているように見えます。
嘘だ！
Zenya screamed indignantly.
嘘つくんじゃねえよ。何度やったって同じなんだよ。さっきからずっと。
Zenya's visible eye wandered as he ranted. It made Kitani's heart ache to see how gaunt he'd become. These days, Zenya kept himself locked in his room and barely ate. Kitani knew there was nothing he could do, and it was the worst feeling in the world. Zenya glared at him, his expression darkened further.
なんだよ、その顔。哀れだって思ってんのか？この出来損ないのクズがってさ。
そんな、落ち着いてください。
うるさい！
All of a sudden, the anger drained from Zenya's face, and a soft smile played at his lips.
わかってるよ。そんなに何度も言われなくても。わかってるよ。
Defective. The word had been hurled at him countless times, even by him. Two days ago, the morning of the fight, Zenya had been waiting for Tetsuo by the shoe lockers. He hated Tetsuo with a fiery passion, but he hadn't planned on making a scene. He just wanted to mess with him a little. As Tetsuo passed by the lockers, Zenya had had come up to him and whispered in his ear.
お前が大好きな幼児はさ、化け物なんだよ。幼児のそばにいるとさ、みんな狂っちゃうんだよ。だからさ、お前なんかが手を出せる存在じゃないんだよ。あいつは化け物だ。
The next instant, a dark glow had sparked in Tetsuo's cold eyes. Don't mess with a man's man. Before his brain could register what he was seeing, he felt a burning impact on his cheek. Then, before he could process that he'd been punched, it happened a second time. Just as he was about to punch back, the nearby students and teachers had intervened. He resented losing his chance to retaliate, but part of him had found the situation entertaining. After all, he had managed to get a rise out of the stone-cold Tetsuo. That had been his goal, of course, but he hadn't expected so intense a reaction. Which part of what he'd had said had triggered him, he wondered. Afterward, he'd taken him down to the staff room, where his homeroom teacher, whose name he barely remembered, had sent him home with a warning. Then, on his way out of the room, Zenya had bumped into him. The one man other than Tetsuo for whom he felt pure hatred. He had nothing but contempt for Zenya, hid it in public, but when they were alone, he went out of his way to make his feelings clear. They'd had several such encounters in the past, and now Zenya made an effort to avoid him wherever possible. This time, however, that hadn't been an option. As they passed in the nearly empty hallway, the man had muttered a single word, so quiet that only Zenya could hear. And that word had stabbed him in the heart like a knife. Zenya had stopped and spun on his heels. The other man had come to a stop as well, his back still turned.
オスは君だけじゃないんだよ。
また、殴られたい。
The man had chuckled and then walked off. Zenya had watched him leave. Even his lab coat had seemed to be mocking him, the way it swayed as he walked. Slowly, rage had swelled up from the pit of his stomach until his entire body shook. Defective. Zenya didn't need anyone to tell him that. Oh, teacher knows more than he said. Zenya covered his face with both hands.
坊ちゃん。
A low giggle escaped through the gap between his hands. He couldn't help it. It was all so hilarious.
俺は、出来損ない。なんだって。さ。
The boy's shoulders shook with what? Sobs? Laughter? Katani closed his eyes and turned away. It was some time before silence returned to the dining room. The next day, the rain had let up and the rays of sunshine peeked through the clouds. And that is where you know what? Yeah, we'll keep going. The humidity was a herald of summer's approach, and Yuji headed to school amid the fading traces of the storm. His condition had been clearly stable lately. He still felt a little lethargic, as if running a mild fever, but it was nothing he couldn't ignore. There'd be no further episodes either. He only hoped this would last. Arriving at the school, Yuji took his seat. As he hung up his book bag, he glanced toward the front of the room. There, Makoto was chatting happily with his friends. He seemed to be back to his usual self. Perhaps Yuji didn't need to be concerned. But then he saw something that made him pause. For a split second, Makoto looked like he was on the verge of tears. The way he looked on Yuji's doorstep. But it passed in an instant, and he was smiling cheerfully again. Were Yuji's eyes playing tricks on him? Seeking an escape, Yuji turned toward the window. Tetsuo was sitting there staring outside, with his head propped up on one hand. What was it with Tetsuo and scenery? Even on the rooftop, he was always gazing out at the town. His face was unreadable, impenetrable. Yuji still didn't understand what made him tick. And yet, strangely enough, he didn't seem as intimidating as he used to. Aww. Morning classes ended and the bell rang to signal the start of lunch period. As Yuji contemplated how to spend the break, Tetsuo stood up from his desk and walked over.
白沼勉強。昨日言ってたやつ。昼休みって。あ。
He barely recalled the conversation. At the time, he'd been in a state of near panic, and details were fuzzy. Meanwhile, everyone in the room was staring at them, amazed that Tetsuo had started a conversation. Unable to endure the attention, Yuji stood up.
ちょっと。
Yuji headed for the roof of the old school building. Tetsuo was the kind of guy who drew attention whether he meant to or not. If they were going to get any study done, it would have to happen somewhere out of the public eye. Yuji walked down the noisy halls, cut through the courtyard, and entered the old building. He didn't bother to check if Tetsuo was behind him. Instead, he simply hurried up the staircase. He could hear another pair of footsteps on the steps with him. Tetsuo. Arriving at the metal door, Yuji pushed it open and stepped out onto the roof. He walked up to the safety fence and turned around, and Tetsuo walked up next to him. And that's where we are going to leave it. I hope you guys have been enjoying this game as much as I have, and I will see you guys next time. Thank you for all your support and love and all the comments and all that jazz. Bye, guys.